Half a day sports fans, we are back here at GDOE. I am Patrick Lujan with GSPN. We are with Superintendent Jon Fernandez. This is just a couple of days after what was a big decision by the GDOE board to keep, to remain on course to separate from the IIAAG, and this has been the story of the year, and a lot of pushback, a lot of issues going on, and thank you for taking time to clarify a lot of things. But from a media standpoint, we've never seen anything like this in the sports community, and I think it's safe to ask you really what happened and transpired over the years, even though there was like at least 80% of the public that are not in favor of this separation.
Well, I guess I'd frame it a different way. I mean, to me, at least the way I'm looking at it after watching the board go through decision making and trying to listen to what the board is asking, is they're really looking for a change in management, a different type of management, perhaps more oversight, more direction. And I think that at least in the conversations with IIAAG, I know Mr. Lujan may have mentioned this, or I mentioned this in a couple meetings, that the IIAAG wasn't structured the way that he thought, and I think the board thought it needed to be to provide that level of oversight. So obviously everybody asked, like, why did it happen?
Mm-hmm.
What set this off? And they'll point to past issues such as the IIAAG kind of voting to go to a 3-season schedule,
mm-hmm.
Away from the 4-quarter schedule, and then we got in the middle of it because we, at least at DOE, had never been engaged in that conversation, and we said we're just not ready to go. And so that was what people point back to. People point to different issues of different specific incidents like during a season. So I know that the most recent one that may have started this last round of conversation was the Simon Sanchez wrestling situation. I know that the team there making complaints about not being able to host the championship, complaints about students not being able to affiliate with other schools, the lack of a coach, and there was just a lot of. Again, this at that point when I started hearing about this myself, a superintendent, you know how that works,
mm-hmm.
goes up the chain, and all of a sudden it's on my lap. I typically say, well, that's a IIAAG thing, and I'm not really involved. I don't really have any visibility. I'm not investigating it. That's a league issue, and we'll let it sort itself out. But I think the board looked at it and said, we get a lot of these issues, complaints, and in fact, some people say, why don't you guys, take a look at this and maybe move in a different direction? And I think the issue for them was that we didn't have a lot of visibility. Even though our schools are members, as a department, we haven't really taken a close look and had any oversight or any real set any real direction at least for our sports program. And what I mean by direction is, what are the goals? What are the outcomes? What are we trying to do? Are we looking at all the issues and complaints? Or are we just pushing it off to IIAAG? A critical point, I think, in the conversations that we had several work sessions, and we had a work session where we had, we've had IIAAG members there. We have public-private schools and representing, and I know that our Simon Sanchez AD Randy Kakigi, who was president of IIAAG at the time,
mm-hmm.
Came to the table, and Mr. Lujan had been going through his issues and concerns. And I asked Mr. Kakigi, and this is not to say anything about Mr. Kakigi personally, but as the president of the IIAAG, I was trying to give Mr. Lujan some assurance that whatever was going on, these issues that were giving rise to this discussion about separation, was going to be handled by IIAAG. And so I asked Mr. Kakigi, I said, in the past few months, this must have been in March or April. And we had talked about this since November, December. I said,
mm-hmm.
Has IIAAG sat down and talked with its members about what's going on? What are the issues? Are there complaints? People have any concerns? And Mr. Kakigi said, no, we haven't. And I think the board's perspective is that the IIAAG's primary responsibility is to just run the day-to-day operations of the sports seasons.
Mm-hmm.
But what about these bigger issues? What about are we addressing complaints about equity, fairness, safety, dispute resolution? Who's looking at that, especially for our school, so that we don't have to just hear the complaints and then just push it off to IIAAG? So I can't speak for every member, that being their reason. What I'm taking it from their message is that when they handed it to me, I think what they wanted me to do for the next 2 years is bring everybody together, figure out what these complaints are, and address them in the bylaws, in the Constitution. Look at the gaps. What do we need to talk more about that we haven't talked more about, like safety, and put those issues in writing. Develop protocols, develop the partnerships needed to improve that area. And in 2 years, we'll see where we're at. And if we feel comfortable just going back out and going back to just a day-to-day operations, then we'll be better able to do that. So again, the message I got from the board is oversight, strategic direction, and try to provide a framework for really addressing sports at least for the public schools, which we have purview over, in a comprehensive way, and not simply day-to-day operation of the league and letting the schools fend for themselves.
Okay, so let's take a step back some 20 years ago, because that's how long the IIAAG
Right.
has been in existence. 1999, the reason the formation it had was because people felt that DOE at that time could not run a school, a sports program.
Right.
Hence the creation of this body. What do you say to those people who say they couldn't do it the first time around? What makes you think they can do it this time around?
Well, I think at least from what I've heard, because I wasn't aware of all the different issues that gave rise to it, but what I've heard is that the challenges there had to do a lot with money, and basically the department having sufficient funds to pay for the sports programs, pay officials, pay coaches, and so forth. And I think that, from my understanding, that was a reason why the decision was made to sort of put it somewhere else outside the department. I know the governor talked about Healthy Futures Fund and trying to create a dedicated fund to support these interscholastics, and so I think that part for sure has been an improvement. And what happens there is that every year we get funding that comes to the Department of Education, and that funding is set aside and reserved to support the sports program. So I think the funding issues are addressed.
Okay.
If it's just a funding issue, I think that the governor, when she was a senator, the legislature passed that law. It survived that period of time, a dedicated source of funding. So I think people are used to collecting those funds and reserving them and using them for that specific purpose. So I think that part I'm not as concerned about. And certainly over the past 5-6 years, we've done our best to really improve the financial management side of the issue. If people say we can't pay now, I'm saying, well, it's the same situation whether it's under IIAAG or GDOE. The funding's there, and if you're saying we're not able to pay under one situation, it'll be the same under different management. But I think the funds are there and the funds are available, and so it's really now a question of how do we move forward and how do we tackle these questions about where are we heading with sports, not just for each individual school to answer for themselves, but for all of our student athletes.
So speaking of the Healthy Futures Fund, right? Our buddy Eddie Pelkey brought up the concept of, hey, wait a minute, I'm a taxpayer too. I chose to send my son to a private school. Should all those athletes have the same allocation coming out of that fund as your taxpayer? Well,
I'm open to the discussion. I think that's really a role for our public policy makers to decide. I know Eddie, and we always have these discussions. He mentioned busing. As a busing, I told him, hey, busing on Guam is not handled this way if you go anywhere in the mainland.
Yeah.
So there's nowhere in the mainland do you see a public school bus system supporting the private schools. Usually it's mass transit if it does. If there's a mass transit system that works, then you'll see public and private school students able to use that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never seen any other jurisdiction use the public school bus system to support private schools. So I would say that's kind of an only on Guam thing, and maybe you don't want to use that analogy too far, because that doesn't mean that should happen in every situation. But with regard to the sports funding, I think the issue for us right now is there are probably some ideas on suggestions that would work to ensure that the needs of all of our student athletes are met. At this point, I'm still trying to find out how much it really is going to truly cost to run the program. People say, well, don't overspend or spend more than you get. And so I'm trying to really ensure that we spend within our means, right? Whatever we collect for sports, we spend. But I know there's other discussions about, are we paying coaches enough? Stipends haven't changed in two decades for our coaches. What are we doing to invest in coaching and officiating in terms of professional development and improving the quality of their skill sets?
There's lots
of those questions out there. So I think as we look at who gets the money, I think the issue is what do we need to really run a successful sports program for all of our students. And then where does that money need to go to make that happen?
Mm-hmm.
So it could happen in different ways, but the real key question is, what do we need the money for? Is it and what's the best use of those resources, and can we agree on that first? Because if you're talking about, I think for me, what I want to make sure that we can do is, at the very least, if we start, I think the first priority for me is starting to look at safety. Mm-hmm. And you don't get very far with safety without starting to look at facility standards. Mm-hmm. You look at those two things, you're starting to talk about what resources do we have to make sure we can invest. So before we start talking about private, public, let's talk about what we need to really create a sports program across the board that'll be, suitable and good for for our student athletes.
I think a couple of other issues that need clarity and coming straight from you would be the notion of lowering the standards of GPA,
right? Number
one, and then also the interleague play. So can you talk on those two topics?
So yes, I remember Mr. Lohan may have made a comment about looking at the GPA and whether that needed to change, and that set off a firestorm of discussion about that being the secret intent of the board and of the department to take over sports and try to, start to immediately address those issues. So my response to anyone who's asked me is that, first of all, that discussion, that point that he made, came after the original decision. So the board had already made its decision, and then he went further and talked about his personal, issues and things that he wanted to look at himself. What I reminded everybody is, number one is, once that decision was made, the operations fall to me, and to help run, and certainly I haven't been looking and thinking about making significant policy changes rather than just transitioning smoothly, mm-hmm. and then start to take a look at those policy issues. And then on the policy front, what's different from an organization that's kind of outside of government and the one that's inside of, when you're inside government, is we have a lot of processes to go through policy making. We don't just make policy in a meeting. You'll see opportunities for public discussion. I'm sure that the board members will have different perspectives on that particular question. I'm sure that if they want to make those changes, they're going to ask me to do research into what other states and mm-hmm. districts are doing with regard to GPA, with regard to eligibility for sports, and then using that information, determining whether we need to change the policies on Guam. I mean, what I understood, without going into too much details, I understand that we're not directly in line with other states in terms of our eligibility standards. So, where those differences exist, does it make sense for us to be in line, or does it make sense for us to be more restrictive or less restrictive? So again, we just wanted to save that. We didn't want to do that mid-year.
Sure.
So for the message for everybody is, we're status quo. There aren't any major policy changes other than the shifting the operations
2.0.
of the league. Yep. And then later on we'll have a chance to talk about not just eligibility issues, but again, safety protocols, guidelines, facility standards, and other important issues I think need to be discussed.
Okay, so that's not on your priority list right now.
Right. No, I know it's on the mind of people because it came out in a comment to the media, but I definitely will affirm that I know that wasn't a driving concern when the board made its decisions about the organization, and nor have I seen it carried much further other than for Mr. Lohan mentioning it. And I also think that the intent for him was really to think about how can we be more inclusive in allowing students who might benefit from being in sports to have some access, and what are the right standards. But it came out in that way, and I think a lot of people have been using it to try to undermine the decision that was made. But I honestly, the decision that was made had to do a little bit more with oversight, where are we headed, what's the direction of our sports programs versus that GPA question. Is interleague. I think when we first moved, I know that the board said, we really want to take control of our public school programs. And again, oversight, and what are we doing, where are we going, and get the right stakeholders involved. But never did they give me never did they prohibit me from inviting others to participate. So when we had the chance, in October, I sent a letter to IIAAG, and then also extended the invitation to all the non-public school participants, stakeholders, to let us know if you want to join us, mm-hmm. and we'll figure out how to incorporate interleague play. And we did that because we recognized that there were sports that there aren't enough private non-public schools, mm-hmm. to run a full league.
Sure.
And I certainly didn't want to be the superintendent saying, we're going to go take our teams over here and leave you to found it for yourself. So we immediately, I was thinking about football, because mm-hmm. it was coming out of first quarter, but there are several sports like that with rugby, mm-hmm. Softball, tennis. And so immediately I wanted to see if we could just bring them over, just run a full season so that no student athletes had to go without. Now there are sports where we have enough teams on both to potentially run like 2 divisions, maybe a public and private division. That's what we're going to experiment with basketball. So there'll be 2, hopefully if it all kind of comes together, 2 separate divisions of private and public with interleague play. Once, the teams will be able to compete once, and then hopefully we can do the pre and postseason competitions and come up with maybe public or private champion, going up against each other. Something different. Yeah. But I know you've been working, you kind of looked at the pre and postseason types of opportunities for these student athletes to participate, and I think that's exciting. Kind of brings everything to a head, and I hope that that comes to reality. Yeah. And so we'll do something similar with fourth quarter sports and so forth. Again, where you don't have enough teams to support separate leagues, let's get them together. And where there are enough teams, let's think about something different, but keep the interleague play going.
Finally, I think when it all boils down to everything, because I've been covering this thing, talking, in the back room with Al and Terry DeBold and Mark and yourself and other stakeholders, and everyone wants the best for the student athlete. But then when we talk to the student athletes, they're saying, hey, we weren't even involved and we weren't even invited to the table. And then we're seeing it also in social media after the board had made that decision, that we have countless amounts of students and the athletes saying, how come we weren't given that opportunity? What do you say to the student athlete after all is said and done on how this whole thing came about? They're saying that, hey, these decision makers are, they're making decisions without us.
Well, I guess what I'd say to that is, and I'm glad we're talking, because this is one of the ways that we try to get the information out. I think a lot of what I've heard from students, both public school students and private school students, some of that's based on not just having the full picture, full understanding of what's being done, why it was done, where are we headed. And I hope over time, as we get that information out, everybody, not just our students, but our families and our stakeholders, will all understand kind of where we're headed. But what I will say, again, this is why I put that letter out there and that press release out there, is there are 3 myths that are going out there that the students are talking about. My daughter's in high school. She was part of the group. There were the athletes who were brought in and kind of explained, and we've explained to them what's happening, trying to clarify. But there are students who weren't in those forums, and we still need to reach out to them. So this week we've been pushing out that information on 3 points. One is that there will be interleague play between public and private school teams. I think people were, there were a lot of students saying, if we're separate, I don't support it. I don't support being separate if we're not able to play. Well, one of the things I want to dispel is that, no, we are going to play each other. And especially in those sports where there's not enough teams, it's going to look like normal. It's just going to be run by DOE under the ESA league. So maybe the ESA thing will change, but that schedule should look just like it did, last year. The second issue was, do schools have to pay additional fees to be part of ESA league now, even if they're part of IIAG? So the answer to that is no. We're not going with any fees this year. We want to make sure that we invite our private schools to play, and we want them to play. So we don't want any obstacles. And then the third thing was, is there a pay to play for students? Just do any students. And I think what the initial concern was with affiliating students, but it got to a point where every student, other students were saying, do I have to pay? No students have to pay to play, other than the sort of the normal fees that might go into your uniforms and things that you might be dealing with as a team, and you making that decision as a team. But there isn't any fee just to participate in the sport, especially for those affiliating students who don't have a home team, want to affiliate and play with another school. They'll be welcome in without any fees. So those are the 3 things that I heard out there. I think for students, who knows what the opinions will be over time. But I will say that part of my job is to make sure that they have accurate information and understand that a lot of the fears that they had, a lot of it's stoked by media reports and reading in the paper that we're going to be separate, we're not going to compete against each other, we're going to lose opportunities, that those myths are dispelled, and let them know that at least while I'm in charge, we're going to maximize those public and private competitions as much as possible. I like it when I go into an arena and you got a public school and you got a private school, and I graduated from a private school, but I work for the public school. They say, who are you for, right? And so I root for the public schools. A lot of my friends on the other side, and then we go at it.
We're usually sitting together at those games.
And then may the best team win, and may the best athletes, come out victorious, and hopefully everyone has a good experience. And we're looking forward to continuing that. For all of our student athletes.
Yeah, definitely a huge shift change in the sports landscape here on Guam. after 20 years of being under the IIAG, we're starting the ESA League in January. So best of luck to Superintendent Jon Fernandez. And we're here to spread the message and clear everything up, and we wish only the best for our student athletes. So thank you so for taking some time out. Merry Christmas to you and your crew.
Merry Christmas to you.
And we'll see you at the games.
All right, see you there.
All right.
Bye-bye.